The gavel slammed against the judge's desk, but it couldn't silence the chaos. The courtroom was suffocating under the weight of the moment. Every eye was locked on the scene unfolding in front of them, one that no one could have predicted, yet no one dared to stop. A woman, standing firm, her dark skin glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights, her voice unwavering despite the storm brewing around her. And across from her, a man in uniform. White. Armed. Furious. The embodiment of authority unchecked. The moment he opened his mouth, the air turned bitter. "You think you can walk in here and talk to me like that?" His voice dripped with disdain, venomous and entitled. He took a step closer, his presence towering, a mountain of arrogance and impunity. "You don't belong here. You don't get to stand there and act like you're worth the same as me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't intervene. No one did. Some looked away. Others watched, entertained by the spectacle, by the audacity of a black woman daring to challenge the system in its own fortress. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. She had spent years preparing for this moment, yet nothing could prepare her for the feeling of having centuries of oppression condensed into a single man's gaze. He wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to every ancestor that had been chained, beaten, discarded like property. He was speaking to every mother who had wept over a son taken too soon, every father who had swallowed his pride just to make it home alive. And then, he did the unthinkable. His hands moved faster than anyone could react. One moment she was standing, unshaken. The next, his arm was wrapped around her throat, squeezing, cutting off her air. Chairs screeched as people shot up from their seats. Shouts rang out, some calling for order, others frozen in shock, their mouths open but voiceless. The judge finally banged his gavel, his face pale with disbelief, but still, no one moved to stop it. She clawed at his grip, her nails digging into his arm, but he was relentless. His breath was hot against her ear, his grip tightening with each second. "You need to learn your place." She felt her body weaken. The edges of her vision blurred. A part of her wondered if this was it. If this was how her story would end, not in a war zone, not on a battlefield, but here, in a courtroom, under the watchful eyes of a system that had never protected her. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. Then, something inside her shifted. She stopped struggling. Stopped clawing. Stopped gasping. And instead, she smiled. It was small at first, barely there, but unmistakable. A slow, creeping expression that sent a ripple of unease through the room. He felt it too, she could tell by the slight hesitation in his grip. A sliver of doubt. She leaned in as much as his grip would allow, her lips parting just enough to let the words spill out, hoarse but sharp as a blade. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The words hung in the air, cutting through the courtroom like a gunshot. His grip faltered, just slightly, but enough. Enough for her to straighten her back, enough for the fire in her eyes to reignite. Enough for the entire room to feel the shift. And then, in an instant, everything changed. What happened next would leave the entire country in shock. It would spark conversations, debates, outrage, and justice in a way no one saw coming. Because this wasn't just about one man abusing his power. This wasn't just about one woman fighting back. No. This was something much bigger. And before the day was over, the man who once believed he was untouchable would find himself in a place he never imagined. Because justice has a way of finding those who think they can outrun it. But how? What did she mean by those words? And what would happen to him that would leave the world speechless? Stay until the end, because this is a story you won't forget. Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black audience. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, injustice, and discrimination of any kind. This channel is a space where powerful stories are told, stories that reflect real struggles, real victories, and real justice. If you've ever faced injustice, know this: your voice matters, your life matters, and your fight for equality is seen and supported. Now, sit back and enjoy this powerful story. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more thought-provoking narratives. Let's dive in. The air inside the courtroom was thick with the weight of history, the kind that couldn't be erased with time or pleasantries. The kind that clung to the walls, to the wooden benches, to the polished floors that had seen countless cases but never enough justice. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the room, but nothing could cleanse the stench of bias that lingered in the air. Seated at the front table, her back straight, eyes sharp, was Naomi Carter. A name that, until this moment, had been uttered only in closed rooms, behind doors guarded by men in suits, where decisions were made in whispers and sealed with handshakes. But today, her name was about to be spoken loudly, defiantly, in a space where voices like hers were meant to stay quiet. Naomi wasn't just another woman standing up against the system, she was the system, or at least a part of it that men like Bradley Whitmore never imagined could exist. She had spent years buried deep in intelligence work, navigating layers of deceit, dismantling corruption from the inside, gathering evidence that could topple even the most untouchable figures. She knew how these men operated, how they viewed people like her, as disposable, insignificant, incapable of wielding true power. She had played the long game, moving in silence, until the moment came to strike. And that moment was now. Across from her, pacing like a lion in a cage, was Officer Bradley Whitmore, a man whose reputation preceded him in the worst way possible. A veteran of the force, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had always gotten away with everything. He was the kind of man who thrived in the shadows of the law, bending rules to fit his own version of justice. The kind of man who believed in control, in power, in dominance over those who he deemed unworthy. He had spent years building his name, earning the respect of men who thought like him, ensuring that no matter what he did, the badge on his chest would protect him. But for the first time in his career, that protection felt thin. Because Naomi Carter wasn't just another protester. She wasn't just another grieving mother, another outraged sister, another faceless victim to be silenced. She was something different, something dangerous to men like him. She was informed. She was calculated. She had something he didn't, knowledge. The case that brought them both to this courtroom was bigger than any single act of brutality. It was about systemic corruption, about the unspoken alliances between law enforcement and crime, about a network of officers who operated above the law, believing they were immune to consequences. And Whitmore, he was right at the center of it. For months, Naomi had been working to expose a web of corruption that ran through the police department like a disease. She had names, transactions, recordings, evidence that couldn't be ignored. She had spent countless nights piecing together every bribe, every cover-up, every act of violence that had been swept under the rug. And today, she was here to put it all on the record, to pull the curtain back and show the world exactly who Bradley Whitmore was. He knew it. And that's why he was seething. His rage wasn't just about the case, it was about her. It was about the fact that she stood there, unmoving, unafraid, refusing to cower before him. He had seen women like her before, proud, defiant, thinking they could change things. And he had always found a way to break them. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. Naomi met his eyes, unwavering. There was no fear in her gaze, and that only made him angrier. "You think you're different, don't you?" His voice was low, dripping with something darker than just anger. "You think you can walk into this courtroom and tear me down?" She didn't respond. Not yet. She knew better than to waste words on a man who had already decided his own truth. "You don't belong here," he continued, each word slow, deliberate, meant to remind her of the way the world worked in his eyes. "You don't get to stand there and act like you're worth the same as me. A murmur swept through the courtroom, uncomfortable shifts in seats, sideways glances exchanged. The judge, an older man with weary eyes, cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. He wanted to, maybe, but men like Whitmore weren't used to being interrupted. Naomi could feel the weight of every person in the room pressing down on her, waiting to see if she would shrink under it. She didn't. "You talk too much," she finally said, her voice calm, controlled, the kind of calm that was more unsettling than anger. "It's almost like you know you're losing." His eyes darkened, his hands clenched into fists. And then, just like that, the control he had spent his whole life gripping onto slipped through his fingers. He moved. Fast. One moment, she was standing, unshaken. The next, his hand was around her throat. The gasp that swept through the courtroom was deafening. People jumped from their seats, frozen in shock, watching as the unthinkable unfolded before them. The judge shouted for order, his gavel slamming down like thunder, but it was too late. Whitmore was already squeezing, already pressing down with the force of every ounce of hate he carried inside him. Naomi's fingers clawed at his arm, her body tense, struggling for breath, but she refused to let panic take over. She knew his type. Knew that he thrived on control, on feeling superior, on watching someone break beneath him. So she did something he wasn't expecting. She stopped fighting. She let her hands drop. Let her shoulders relax. Let her lips curl into something cold and knowing. And then she leaned in, just enough for her breath to brush against his ear. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The shift in the room was palpable. It was as if those words cracked something open in the air, something unseen but undeniable. Because in that moment, the power dynamic that had existed for so long, the one he had relied on, the one that had protected him, shattered. And he felt it. Naomi Carter wasn't just another black woman he could silence. She wasn't just another victim. She was something else entirely. And before this day was over, Bradley Whitmore would learn exactly what that meant. The room had gone still, suffocated by the weight of what had just happened. Naomi could still feel the ghost of his grip on her throat, the imprint of his arrogance pressing into her skin like a bruise that hadn't yet surfaced. But she wasn't broken. Far from it. She stood exactly where she had been before he lost control, her posture unwavering, her breathing steady. The only difference now was the shift in the air, the silent acknowledgement that something had changed. That he had lost something the moment he put his hands on her. Bradley Whitmore, however, hadn't realized it yet. His hands trembled as he finally let go, stepping back, chest heaving, eyes burning with something between rage and the creeping tendrils of realization. He had moved without thinking, without considering the weight of what he had just done in front of so many people. The judge's gavel slammed down again, the sharp, repetitive cracks cutting through the tension, demanding control over a room that had already spiraled beyond his grasp. "Officer Whitmore," the judge's voice thundered, attempting to command the same authority he once carried, but it was laced with hesitation, with uncertainty. This was beyond anything he had expected. "You will stand down immediately." But Whitmore barely heard him. His eyes were locked on Naomi, searching, analyzing, trying to understand why she wasn't gasping for breath, why she wasn't crumbling under the weight of his fury. Why she wasn't afraid. She wiped at her throat absent-mindedly, as if brushing away an inconvenience rather than an act of violence. And then she did it again, she smiled. Small, barely noticeable, but there. A flicker of something that sent a chill down his spine. "What the hell are you smiling at?" His voice was low, guttural, almost a whisper meant only for her. She tilted her head, studying him like a predator assessing its prey. "You just gave me everything I needed," she said, her voice measured, controlled, almost pitying. The words settled between them, thick and heavy, but before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom burst open. The sound of heavy boots against the marble floor sent a jolt through the space as federal agents stormed inside, their presence like a force of nature. They moved with precision, with purpose, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. The seal of the Department of Justice gleamed on their badges. The tension in Whitmore's shoulders turned to stone. Everything slowed. Every instinct in his body told him that something was wrong. That something was very, very wrong. The lead agent, a man whose face was carved with years of experience, stepped forward. His gaze flicked from Naomi to Whitmore, then to the judge. His voice was calm but absolute. "We have an arrest warrant." Whitmore's heart slammed against his ribcage. For a split second, he thought, no, hoped, that it was for her. That somehow, she was the one they had come for. That maybe she had played her hand too early, maybe she had slipped up, maybe justice was still tilted in his favor. But then the agent's next words shattered that illusion. "For Officer Bradley Whitmore." The silence that followed was deafening. Whitmore blinked. He heard the words, but they didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His body felt rooted to the floor, stuck between denial and the slow, creeping realization that this wasn't a mistake. The entire courtroom was frozen in place, watching, waiting. Some faces were stunned, others unreadable, a few barely containing the glimmer of something that looked dangerously close to satisfaction. Naomi didn't move. She didn't gloat. She just watched. "This is bullshit," Whitmore finally spat, his voice sharper now, cutting through the tension with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for air. "You can't be serious. You think you can walk in here and..." The agent didn't blink. "We have evidence. Over 100 documented reports of excessive force, illegal detainments, racial profiling, and cover-ups. You were warned. You were investigated. And now, Officer Whitmore, you're being held accountable." The words slammed into him harder than any blow ever could. Evidence. The word burned in his mind, echoing, twisting, unraveling everything he thought was untouchable. And then, it clicked. He turned his head, slow, almost robotic, his gaze landing back on her. Naomi. The woman he had underestimated. The woman he had attacked. The woman who now stood before him, calm, steady, in control, watching as his world collapsed. "You set me up," he breathed, the words barely making it past his lips. She didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it, either. She didn't need to. Because the truth was already unfolding before him. The agent nodded to his men, and they stepped forward, their hands firm, their grips unyielding as they grabbed Whitmore's arms, forcing them behind his back. The unmistakable sound of handcuffs locking into place echoed through the room. And suddenly, the power he had held so tightly for years was gone. For the first time in his life, Bradley Whitmore wasn't the one issuing orders. He wasn't the one in control. And when he finally looked back at Naomi, when his eyes met hers one last time before they took him away, he saw something in her gaze that terrified him. It wasn't victory. It wasn't smugness. It was certainty. A certainty that told him that this wasn't the end. That this was just the beginning. And that whatever was coming next, he wouldn't survive it. The metal of the handcuffs dug into Bradley Whitmore's wrists, a constant, biting reminder that something had shifted irreversibly in his world. His arms ached from the tight grip of the federal agents escorting him, their hands firm, their movements precise. There was no leniency, no consideration for the badge he once wore with unchecked authority. He had been dragged through the hallways of the courthouse like a criminal, no, as a criminal, and the thought made his blood boil. He had spent years believing in his own invincibility, believing that the power he wielded, the alliances he built, and the fear he instilled would shield him forever. But now, as he was shoved into a dimly lit interrogation room, his breath ragged, his heartbeat pounding against his skull like a war drum, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Uncertainty. The room smelled of disinfectant and desperation, of old cases and broken men who had sat in that very chair, believing, like he once had, that they could talk their way out, that the system would bend for them like it always had. The walls were painted a dull gray, cold and impersonal, as if designed to strip away any sense of control from the person sitting at the metal table. There was a single overhead light, casting sharp shadows across the surface, illuminating a thick manila folder that rested ominously in front of the seat he was forced into. Whitmore inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself, to reclaim even an ounce of the dominance he had spent his career maintaining. But it was slipping, like sand through his fingers, and the more he clenched, the more it poured away. The door opened with a soft click, and Naomi Carter entered, her steps measured, deliberate, each one a statement. She was calm, too calm, exuding a quiet power that rattled him more than if she had come in screaming for his head. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to plead. She was here because she had already won. She pulled out the chair across from him, not once breaking eye contact as she settled into her seat. The folder remained untouched for now, but its presence was suffocating. It wasn't thick, but it didn't need to be. Just a few pages of truth were enough to bury a man. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring, taut and loaded with something lethal. Whitmore could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. Then, finally, she spoke. "Officer Whitmore," she said, her voice level, steady, giving nothing away. "I assume you've had enough time to figure out why you're here." His teeth clenched. Every syllable that came from her mouth made his skin crawl, not just because of what she was saying, but because of how she was saying it. Like she was in charge. Like he was the one with something to prove. He leaned forward, his wrists twisting against the metal cuffs. "I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, but this won't hold. I have people," she cut him off with a slow shake of her head, her lips curving just slightly. Not a smile. Not exactly. More like pity. "You have people," she repeated, tilting her head slightly, as if the phrase amused her. "Not anymore." His pulse spiked. The way she said it, so sure, so final, sent a chill skittering down his spine. He refused to show it. Instead, he forced a scoff, shaking his head as if she were speaking nonsense. But Naomi saw through it. She saw everything. She tapped the folder once, a soft movement, but it may as well have been a gunshot. "You think this is about what happened in the courtroom?" she asked, her tone still calm, still controlled, still razor-sharp. "That was just an opportunity. A gift, really. You gave me exactly what I needed." His muscles tensed, his jaw locking so tightly that pain shot down his neck. "You set me up." Another slight tilt of her head, another slow blink that spoke of patience rather than victory. "No," she corrected, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 truths he wasn't ready to hear. "You set yourself up. You've been doing it for years. You just finally did it in front of the right people." Whitmore's breath came harder now, shorter, faster. He knew what was coming next, he could feel it, but his body refused to accept it. His survival instincts screamed at him to fight back, but how could he fight something he couldn't even see? Then Naomi reached for the folder, flipping it open with the kind of ease that suggested she had done this before. That she had already lived this moment 100 times in her head. The first page was slid toward him. His eyes dropped automatically, scanning the contents before his brain could register what he was seeing. His blood turned to ice. The first image was a still shot, grainy but unmistakable. A face. A name. Carter Reynolds. A dead teenager. A case he thought had been buried with him. Whitmore felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. His mouth was dry, his skin burning hot and ice-cold at the same time. "I was cleared." His voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. Naomi nodded, unfazed. "By your own people," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She flipped to another page, this one filled with signatures, timestamps, documentation that should never have resurfaced. But see, the thing about the truth. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to something almost intimate. It has a way of crawling back. He couldn't breathe. She flipped again. A signed testimony. A sworn statement. From inside his own department. Someone had flipped. Someone on his own side. His entire body locked up. Who? Naomi exhaled slowly, tapping the name at the bottom of the page. Someone who finally realized that covering for you wasn't worth it anymore. His head shook violently. This is real, she interrupted, her voice like iron. This is happening. He felt sick. His entire world was caving in. The door swung open, and two more agents stepped inside, their eyes unreadable. One of them spoke, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. He's ready for transfer. Whitmore's heart slammed against his ribs. Transferred where? No one answered. Naomi stood, smoothing her blazer, watching him with that same measured gaze. And for the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not pity. Not smugness. Finality. Her voice was barely a whisper when she leaned down, just enough for only him to hear. Where you're going, she murmured, they already know your name. A chill ripped through him. Because he knew exactly what that meant. And for the first time in his life, Bradley Whitmore felt real fear. The silence in the interrogation room stretched, thick and suffocating. Bradley Whitmore's breath came in short, uneven gasps, his mind scrambling for an escape that didn't exist. Every second that passed felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of his life as he knew it. The weight of Naomi Carter's words still hung in the air, pressing down on him like an unbearable force. Where you're going, they already know your name. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as he struggled against the restraints that bound his wrists. The steel cuffs had never felt heavier. He was used to being the one giving orders, the one standing on the other side of the table, watching as someone else squirmed under the pressure. But now, he was the one trapped. The one with no answers. The one who had just realized that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Naomi hadn't moved. She sat back in her chair, her eyes locked onto him with the kind of calm that made his skin crawl. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't gloating. It was finality. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw. You think you're so damn smart, he rasped, his voice hoarse, his desperation barely concealed behind the anger. You think this means something? That this changes anything? She didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Didn't give him the reaction he wanted. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as if she were considering the question. This means everything, she said finally, her tone even, almost soft, but cutting deeper than any knife. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head, the adrenaline in his veins making his body tremble. You don't get it, do you? His voice was tight, shaking with a fury that was no longer controlled. I built this system. I am this system. You think putting me in cuffs changes a damn thing? You think I won't walk out of here? You think I won't have someone make a few calls, get this whole thing to disappear? He leaned forward, eyes burning, voice lowering into something dark and venomous. I have friends in places you can't even imagine. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the table, the sound rhythmic, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock running out of time. I know exactly who your friends are, she said, her voice calm, steady. I know every name, every transaction, every case you thought was buried. I know the men who covered for you, who erased footage, who signed off on fabricated reports. I know who looked the other way when you executed Carter Reynolds in cold blood. His body went rigid. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. And so do they. A fresh wave of terror rolled through him. She wasn't lying. He could see it in her eyes. She had everything. For the first time since this nightmare started, he felt it. The abyss opening beneath him. Bullshit, he hissed, but the word didn't carry the weight it once had. If that were true, if you really had all of that, why am I still sitting here? Naomi's expression didn't change. She simply waited. Then the door opened again. Another agent entered, taller, broader, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. He carried himself with a presence that made the air feel heavier. The room shrank in size, and Whitmore could feel the shift immediately. This wasn't just another federal officer. This was someone with real power. The agent nodded once to Naomi before turning his gaze to Whitmore. "We're ready for transport." Whitmore's skin turned to ice. He expected them to say he was being taken to a federal facility. He expected them to say he was going to be booked, to face charges, to be held for trial. But they didn't. Instead, the agent spoke 4 words that sent pure dread crawling up his spine. "You're being reassigned custody." His pulse skipped. He looked at Naomi, searching for some kind of explanation, but she just sat there, unmoving, watching him as if she were studying his reaction. "Custody," he repeated, his voice cracking just slightly. "Where the hell am I going?" No one answered him. The silence stretched, unbearable, suffocating. And then the agent stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs around his wrists, only to replace them with another pair. Different ones. Whitmore stared down at them, his breathing uneven. These weren't federal-issue handcuffs. These were state prison restraints. His stomach twisted. This wasn't how federal charges worked. He should have been processed differently. He should have been placed in a protective unit, handled with care, given time to call his lawyer, to make arrangements, to pull the strings that needed pulling. Instead, they were treating him like any other inmate. Like someone they didn't intend to protect. The realization crashed into him like a freight train. He was being sent somewhere deliberate. Somewhere dangerous. Somewhere that people like him didn't survive. His chest tightened, panic finally breaking through the last of his defenses. "You can't do this." His voice was harsher now, urgent, breaking apart at the edges. "This isn't how this works. I have rights." Naomi finally stood, smoothing out her blazer as she met his gaze with something that looked a lot like satisfaction, but not revenge. Not anger. Just certainty. "This is exactly how this works," she said simply, tilting her head just slightly. "Welcome to the other side of the system you built." The words knocked the breath from his lungs. And then the agent grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. Whitmore jerked back, resisting, but the strength of the grip on him was unrelenting. He had always been the one dragging people out of rooms, throwing them into cells, silencing their screams. Now, he was the one being dragged. He struggled against it, twisting, fighting, his breath coming in sharp, broken gasps. "You can't send me there," he spat, his voice barely human anymore. "Do you have any idea who I put away? Who's waiting for me?" Naomi just watched as he was pulled toward the door. "I know exactly who's waiting for you." His vision blurred. The door opened wider. And just before he was forced through it, he heard her voice one last time, calm, unwavering, like the echo of a prophecy finally fulfilled. "They already know your name." And then, the door shut behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the last thing he heard before he realized that he was never getting out. The air inside the transport vehicle was thick, heavy, and suffocating, pressing down on Bradley Whitmore's chest with an unbearable weight that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to control his breathing. The metal cuffs wrapped tightly around his wrists and ankles dug sharply into his skin, a cruel reminder that the power he once wielded so freely had been stripped from him completely. Every jolt of the road beneath him sent sharp vibrations through his restrained body, the steel links between the cuffs clanking softly with each subtle movement. The sound was quiet, almost insignificant, but to him, it was deafening. It was a sound of finality, a sound that hammered into his skull with every second that passed. His muscles were locked, his shoulders rigid, his mind spiraling in frantic, uncontrollable directions. He had spent years believing himself to be an immovable force, an untouchable entity protected by the very system that now seemed eager to discard him like he was nothing. And yet, here he was, shackled like an animal, tossed into the back of a transport vehicle like every other criminal he had thrown behind bars. The irony was like acid burning through his insides, but even that paled in comparison to the terror creeping into his bones. Something was wrong. Not just the arrest itself, not just the fact that he had been caught, exposed, betrayed, but the way everything was unfolding. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know the process, to understand the system inside and out. And nothing about this felt like protocol. The transport was too quiet, the agents too careful, too calculated in their movements. No one had given him an answer about where he was going, no one had read out the details of his transfer. There had been no phone call, no legal representation, no confirmation of protective custody. Just chains, silence, and the slow, creeping realization that whatever was happening, it wasn't just a mistake, it was intentional. His breath quickened. He clenched his jaw, his mind clawing desperately for an explanation, for any possible reason that could make this make sense. But the deeper he thought, the darker the realization became. They were getting rid of him. His throat felt tight, his skin burning hot despite the cold metal pressed against him. He had spent years believing that the world operated on rules that he understood, rules that benefited men like him, men who knew how to play the game, how to bend the law just enough to get what they wanted while keeping their hands clean. But this wasn't a game anymore. He wasn't the one pulling the strings. He wasn't above the law. He was the law. At least, he had been. But now, he was nothing. The vehicle slowed. The shift was so small, so subtle, but it sent a shockwave through him. His breath caught in his throat, every muscle in his body locking up. This was it. He had seconds to prepare himself, but for what? A federal holding facility? A courtroom for formal charges? A back alley execution under the guise of a transfer gone wrong? The uncertainty was like a noose tightening around his neck. The doors swung open, and the first thing that hit him was the heat, thick, humid, clinging to his skin like an oppressive force. It was the kind of heat that wasn't just hot but suffocating, wrapping around him like an unseen grip, making the air feel heavier, harder to breathe. The second thing was the silence. No murmurs of legal discussions, no bustling of officers processing detainees, no controlled chaos of a federal facility. Just the quiet hum of something much worse. Then he saw it. His entire body went rigid, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a wild animal trapped in a cage. The prison. Not just any prison. Not a cushioned federal facility where disgraced officers were sent to wait out their sentences in relative safety. Not a low-security holding center where the worst consequence would be a few uncomfortable nights behind bars before a deal was brokered. No. This was something far worse. The name printed across the towering steel gates made his blood run ice cold. This was maximum security. His breath turned shallow, his vision tunneling as reality slammed into him all at once. This wasn't just about an arrest. This wasn't about justice or due process. This was punishment. This was revenge. This was a deliberate sentence without trial, without appeal, without hope. He had sent men here. Men who had been labeled too dangerous for normal incarceration. Men whose names had become statistics, buried under redacted reports and quietly forgotten headlines. Men who hated him. And now, he was about to be locked inside with them. The guards were already moving toward him, their expressions blank, their hands firm as they grabbed him by the arms and pulled him forward. He tensed, resisting out of pure instinct, his feet planting into the ground, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice raw, frantic, betraying the fear crawling under his skin like a living thing. "This isn't how this works. I know the system. I know my rights. The guards didn't care. They yanked him forward, his body stumbling as they dragged him toward the towering gates, toward the concrete hell that was about to swallow him whole. His wrists burned against the restraints, the metal digging deeper, but nothing compared to the fire raging inside his chest. Then, he heard it. A voice. Quiet at first, almost indistinguishable from the thick air pressing against him. Then another. And another. They were whispering his name. He turned his head sharply, his breath stalling as he saw them. A group of inmates, gathered near the entrance, watching. Their faces were unreadable, their expressions neutral, but there was something behind their eyes. Something dark. Something patient. Something familiar. Then, one of them spoke. Whitmore. It was soft. Almost amused. Another chuckled, the sound rolling through the air like distant thunder. Recognition slammed into him like a freight train. They knew him. Not as a fellow inmate. Not as someone who had simply been thrown into the same system as them. No. They knew him. They remembered everything he had done. The faces he had beaten, the names he had erased, the lives he had destroyed. And now, they were waiting. His stomach twisted violently, his breath turning ragged, his entire body locking up as the realization settled deep into his bones. He wasn't going to be just another inmate here. He wasn't going to serve his time, keep his head down, and wait for the legal process to unfold. He was prey. The guards didn't hesitate. They dragged him inside, the doors groaning shut behind him, locking into place with a sound so final, so absolute, that it made his skin crawl. And as he was forced deeper into the prison, as the whispers grew, as the recognition in the inmate's eyes burned into him like a brand, one last thought clawed through his mind, wrapping around his throat like a vice. Naomi Carter's words, spoken with quiet, undeniable certainty. Where you're going, they already know your name. And as the gates locked behind him, as the reality of his fate sank into his bones, he realized something even more terrifying. He was never getting out. The heavy, rusted iron doors clanked shut behind Bradley Whitmore with a sound so final, so absolute, that it sent a visceral shudder through his entire body. The echo of metal reverberated down the cold, narrow hallway, stretching out into the dimly lit prison block where time itself seemed to stand still. His wrists ached from the tightness of the restraints that had only just been removed, the ghost of their grip still burning against his skin like a brand. But none of that compared to the weight of realization crushing down on his chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. His pulse was erratic, his throat dry, his muscles coiled so tightly that even the smallest movement felt strained, as if his own body was rejecting what was happening. But it was happening. It had happened. He was inside. He was trapped. He was one of them now. The guards that had led him here had barely said a word, their faces unreadable, their hands firm and efficient as they processed him like just another inmate. No special treatment. No respect. No hesitation. Just the cold, mechanical execution of protocol, treating him with the same detached indifference that he had once used against so many others. Men he had shoved into cells without a second thought. Men whose faces had blurred together over the years, nothing more than names on files, statistics in a system he had manipulated at will. Now, those statistics were staring back at him, alive, breathing, waiting. Hungry. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, lined with row after row of steel-barred cells stacked on top of one another like a vertical tomb, each one filled with watching eyes. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, metal, and something darker, something unspoken, something that sent a deep, unsettling chill down his spine. He could feel them before he even saw them. The weight of their gazes pressed against his skin like invisible hands, suffocating, predatory, a silent confirmation that word had already spread. The moment he stepped past the first few cells, the murmurs started. Low, quiet at first, whispers slithering through the air like a slow-burning fuse. Then, one voice rose above the others, lazy and drawn out, tinged with amusement, but layered with something more dangerous beneath. "Well, well, look what we have here." Laughter followed, a ripple of sound moving through the block, not loud, not forced, but knowing. Another voice joined in, sharper, with an edge that made Whitmore's jaw tighten. "Ain't this poetic? Man spent his whole life locking people up, now look at him. Bet he never thought he'd end up on the other side of the bars." The chuckles continued, spreading like a growing storm, bouncing from cell to cell, building in intensity. He kept walking, his steps measured, deliberate, refusing to acknowledge them, refusing to look up. His heart pounded so violently that he could feel it in his throat, but he forced his expression to remain neutral, to keep his breathing even. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Then, a deeper voice cut through the noise, low and slow, but filled with something far more chilling than laughter. "You remember us, don't you, Whitmore?" The words landed like a punch to his gut. His entire body tensed involuntarily, and before he could stop himself, his eyes flickered toward the source. And the moment their gazes locked, he knew. He did remember them. He remembered all of them. Faces from his past, faces he had barely given a second glance when he'd been the one throwing them behind bars, faces that had once been nothing more than mugshots on his desk. But now, they weren't just images in case files. They were real. They were here. And they were waiting. A slow smile curled on the lips of the man leaning against the bars of his cell, his arms relaxed, his posture casual, but his eyes burned with something Whitmore recognized all too well. Retribution. The prisoner studied him for a long moment, his silence heavier than the words that had come before. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely carried beyond the bars, he said, "It's funny, ain't it?" He let the question hang in the air, tilting his head just slightly. How the tables turn. Whitmore clenched his jaw so tightly that his teeth ached, forcing himself to keep walking, to keep his eyes forward, his spine straight, his mind focused on anything except the inevitability of what was coming. The guards finally stopped at an empty cell, unlocking the door with a loud metallic groan, the sound sending a fresh jolt of something cold through his veins. One of them yanked off his cuffs before shoving him forward with no regard for balance, for dignity, for the fact that the man they were tossing into this cage had once worn the same badge as them. He stumbled, catching himself on the rough cement wall before straightening, his breathing sharp, his pulse still hammering relentlessly. The guard barely glanced at him before stepping back and sliding the bars shut with an unmistakable clang. "Welcome home." Then, just like that, they were gone. Silence settled over the space, thick and heavy, but not empty. Because he wasn't alone. Not really. Even without turning his head, he could feel the eyes still on him, the weight of the moment pressing down like an iron hand gripping his throat. Then, a quiet chuckle drifted from the neighboring cell. Slow. Unhurried. Whitmore turned his head just slightly, his breath still uneven, his skin crawling with the knowledge that he was being watched. The man sitting on the edge of the cot just a few feet away had his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers laced together, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were steady. Cold. Calculated. "Man," the prisoner murmured, shaking his head slightly, "I'd be lying if I said I ever saw this coming." He let out a slow exhale, almost like a sigh, almost like relief, before finally meeting Whitmore's gaze fully. His lips curled up, not a smirk, not exactly, but something close. "But now that you're here." His voice dropped lower, his tone shifting, becoming something darker. Something inevitable. "I ain't surprised at all." Whitmore's stomach twisted. A long silence stretched between them, heavy, weighted, stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. Then, finally, the prisoner leaned back against the wall, tilting his head slightly as he spoke again, his voice softer this time, but carrying far more weight. "You think anyone's coming for you?" A simple question. An obvious one. And yet, the way he said it, the way he looked at Whitmore when he said it, sent a new kind of terror crawling beneath his skin. Because they both already knew the answer. No one was coming. Not his department. Not his colleagues. Not the system he had spent his entire life serving, twisting, protecting. He was alone. Completely. Utterly. Alone. And in a place like this, that meant he was already dead. The dim, flickering light above Bradley Whitmore's cell cast elongated shadows across the cold concrete walls, stretching and twisting as if the very room itself was breathing. The weight of every set of eyes on him still clung to his skin like a layer of grime that would never wash off. He sat on the edge of the steel cot, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers laced together so tightly that his knuckles ached. His heartbeat had never slowed down, not since the moment those doors shut behind him. Every breath he took felt shallower than the last, every noise from the cells around him, a cough, a murmur, a laugh too low to be anything but private amusement at his expense, made his stomach coil tighter with unease. He had been here for hours, maybe longer. Time had already lost meaning. There was no clock. No way to mark the passing of seconds except by the rhythmic sound of distant footsteps patrolling the walkways above. The guards, however, didn't so much as glance at him. They weren't his allies. Not anymore. Not here. He wasn't just another inmate in this place, he was a trophy. A caged prize for men who had waited a long, long time for their chance at revenge. The chuckle from his neighboring cell returned, quiet but deliberate, dragging him back into the moment. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the man still lounging on his own cot, watching him with that same patient, knowing expression. "You're thinking real hard over there," the prisoner mused, his voice unhurried, almost casual, like they were two men having a conversation over drinks instead of a predator watching its prey slowly suffocate under the weight of realization. Whitmore exhaled through his nose, forcing his shoulders to remain squared, refusing to show weakness. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" His voice was rough, the edges jagged with tension that he was barely containing. The prisoner grinned, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. "Enjoying?" He let the word roll off his tongue, as if he were testing it, tasting it. "Nah. That ain't the right word. But I will say. I've been waiting for this moment a long time." Whitmore clenched his fists, his nails pressing into his palms, trying to hold on to whatever was left of his deteriorating composure. "You think this is funny? You think I'm just gonna roll over and take whatever it is you all have planned?" He knew his voice lacked the force it once carried. Knew that whatever authority he had once commanded was gone. The man in the other cell didn't move, didn't blink. Just watched. "You don't get it yet, do you?" His voice lowered, and something in the way he spoke sent an ice-cold chill crawling up Whitmore's spine. "Ain't about what we got planned, Whitmore. It's about what you earned." Silence stretched thick between them, and for the first time, Whitmore truly felt the depth of what was coming. This wasn't about chance. This wasn't about a few angry men deciding to settle a score. This was inevitable. His breath turned shallow. The prisoner tilted his head, studying him like a man who had seen this exact scenario play out in his mind for years, long before Whitmore had ever even considered the idea that he could end up here. "You ever think about it?" he continued, his voice a low murmur now, laced with something heavier than just amusement. "All the people you put in places just like this. All the lives you ruined because you could. Because you had the badge. The power. You ever stop and wonder what happened to them after the fact?" Whitmore's jaw locked, his breathing controlled but shallow. "You thought they just disappeared, huh?" The prisoner leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "You thought they just sat in their cells, serving their time, thinking about what they did wrong? Nah, man." His head shook slightly, his smirk fading into something harder. "Something honest. They sat in their cells thinking about you." Whitmore felt his stomach churn. "They sat there," the man continued, voice steady, relentless, every single night. Stewing. Hating. Counting the days. Imagining what they'd do if they ever got the chance to return the favor. And you? You walked around out there, safe, untouchable, never once thinking about what would happen if the cage door ever swung the other way. Whitmore swallowed hard, his throat dry, his hands clammy against his knees. And now? The prisoner exhaled, slow and deep, as if he were savoring the moment. Now, you finally get to feel what they felt. Whitmore forced himself to stay still, to hold on to whatever illusion of control he could. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't fear of a single man, of a single enemy waiting for an opportunity to strike. This was fear of the entire prison. This was fear of every name, every face, every person he had ever wronged, watching. Waiting. Ready. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Whitmore's pulse spiked, his muscles locking up as he heard the sound of keys clinking against metal. A guard stopped in front of his cell, his face unreadable, but his posture told Whitmore everything. It was time. The cell door slid open. Whitmore didn't move, his body still, his breathing uneven. The guard jerked his chin toward the hallway. Shower block. Whitmore's throat tightened. He wasn't a fool. He knew how this worked. He had orchestrated it himself too many times before. The so-called shower block wasn't about hygiene. It was about isolation. About opportunity. For a brief second, he thought about refusing. But that wasn't an option. If he fought, he'd only make it worse. So, he stood. Every movement was slow, deliberate, controlled, at least on the outside. His legs felt like lead as he stepped forward, his heart hammering inside his chest. As he passed the prisoner in the neighboring cell, the man leaned against the bars, watching him go. "See you soon, Whitmore." The door clanged shut behind him. And as he was led deeper into the prison, into the waiting silence of whatever fate had been decided for him, he realized something. This wasn't just punishment. This wasn't just revenge. This was judgment. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to be truly powerless. The silence in the shower block was suffocating. Every inch of Bradley Whitmore's body was tense, his senses heightened to the point of exhaustion, his breath slow but shallow. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, the dim, flickering light casting shadows that stretched unnaturally, making the space feel even smaller than it already was. The guards had left him here. Alone. That alone told him everything he needed to know. He stood under the lukewarm trickle of water, his hands pressed against the tiled wall, his mind racing, calculating, desperately searching for an out. There was none. He had known this moment was coming the second he stepped foot inside the prison, but now, standing here, stripped of everything, his badge, his authority, his protection, he felt the true weight of what he had done. Of what he had been. He had never thought about what happened to the men he locked away. Never considered what it was like to be trapped, powerless, watching the days slip away with no hope of escape. A faint creak echoed behind him. He didn't move, didn't turn. He didn't have to. He could feel them. The weight of their presence filled the room like a storm about to break. They had come for him. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed against the wet tile. A shadow moved in his periphery, then another, and another. He swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his throat, but he forced himself to stand straight, to keep his breathing steady. He would not beg. He would not plead. He knew how this worked. He had orchestrated it before. The men who lost their composure, the ones who screamed, who tried to fight, only made it worse. A voice broke through the tension, low, deliberate, laced with something Whitmore had no name for but felt deep in his gut. "Long way from your desk, ain't you, Whitmore?" More footsteps. More bodies closing in. He turned his head just enough to see them. Faces from his past. Faces he had written off. Men whose voices he had ignored when they had begged for fairness, for justice, for a chance. He had denied them all. He had told himself that they deserved their fate, that the system was working exactly as it was meant to. But standing here, in this moment, he saw the truth. The system had never been about justice. It had been about power. And now, that power was in the hands of the very people he had crushed beneath it. The man who had spoken stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You know how this goes, don't you?" Whitmore exhaled slowly. "Yeah." A long pause stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Then, the man nodded slightly, a silent confirmation that Whitmore understood exactly where he stood. The others shifted, waiting. Then, something unexpected happened. The man turned his head toward the door, and after a long moment, he stepped back. The others hesitated, looking between him and Whitmore, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. "Let him be," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "He ain't worth it." Whitmore's breath hitched in his throat. They weren't going to kill him. Not because they had forgiven him. Not because they had forgotten. But because he wasn't even worth their revenge. That realization hit harder than any punch could have. They left one by one, footsteps fading until he was alone again, the water still running, the steam curling around him like a ghost of the man he used to be. He had lost everything. His power. His reputation. His ability to command fear and respect. He was nothing. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it was like to be on the other side. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Naomi Carter stood in the sunlight, her work finished. She had spent years gathering evidence, fighting for justice, exposing corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. Whitmore had been the face of it, but he was just one piece of a much larger machine. There was still more work to be done, more battles to fight, more people to hold accountable. But today, one chapter had closed. She inhaled deeply, watching as the city moved around her, people walking by, unaware of the war she had waged in the shadows to bring one man down. She didn't need applause, didn't need recognition. Justice wasn't about glory. It was about making sure the right people faced the consequences of their actions. And Whitmore? He would never leave that prison. Not because of the men inside. But because the world outside had already moved on without him. And that, in the end, was the real punishment. So now, let's talk about what just happened. This wasn't just a story about revenge. This was a story about consequences. About power, and how easily it shifts when people least expect it. Bradley Whitmore spent his life believing he was above the system, that the rules didn't apply to him, that the power he held was permanent. But the truth? No one is untouchable. There's a moment in this story where Whitmore finally realizes that he isn't feared anymore. That the people he once controlled now see him as nothing. And that's the moment he loses everything. It wasn't the prison walls that trapped him. It wasn't the men waiting in the shadows. It was the knowledge that he no longer mattered. Now, let me ask you, what does justice really mean to you? Is it punishment? Is it revenge? Or is it about something bigger, making sure the people who abuse their power never get to do it again? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge perspectives and leave you thinking long after they're over. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.